Good evening all, and welcome. I just wanted to let you know about this amazing new game from the makers of Angry Birds called Small Town Murders. It already has 2 million players and is growing fast, and is the best mobile puzzle game around. You can put your detective skills to the test with this free Small Town Murders crime mystery puzzle game. You become the investigator with thousands of new levels to choose from, and every crime being a new puzzle. You get to uncover evidence, solve puzzle games, unlock clues, and narrow down the suspect list. Small Town Murders allows you to investigate crime scenes, solve murders, mystery cases, solve matching puzzles to collect clues, and interrogate a cast of quirky characters such as Nora Mystery and Deputy Shanahan, all from the comfort of your own home. And on top of that, there's a special promo at the moment where every new user receives in-game boosters to help solve those extra tricky puzzles. So if you're looking for a challenge, look no further and download Small Town Murders in the description box below to put your detective skills to the test. It's the perfect game while traveling home for Christmas, so why not get the whole family involved and see who can solve the mystery first. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My entire life I've lived in the same home. My grandfather built it in the 70s, and my mum remodeled it while she was pregnant with me. It's in Southern California in a slow and mellow beach community, founded in the 50s, so there's not a lot of paranormal stuff happening. The only peculiar thing while growing up was the man that whistled outside my bedroom window every night at exactly 7:43 p.m. I never thought anything of it, and by the time I was in middle school, I basically used it to keep time. The whistle itself sounds like a man calling to a dog. A short and happy sort of sound. He whistled the same sound every night, at the same time. It even stayed the same during daylight savings time. One night, my mum was in my room with me. Not a common occurrence, as she had her own problems and we didn't see each other often, even when I was younger. I heard the whistle and promptly got up to brush my teeth and wash my face like I did every night, and my mum reacted kind of odd. In retrospect, I can understand why. She was in the middle of saying something and I just walked out of the room. She followed me and asked why I was getting ready for bed this early. Great parenting, Mum. And I just said, I heard the whistle. I'm not going to sleep yet, but it's time for me to get ready at least. I was young, and that's how my mum tells it. She has a terrible memory, but she said that that's the one thing that she can quote verbatim besides the Pledge of Allegiance because it was so unsettling. She hasn't heard any whistle. She didn't want to say anything, so she listened at the exact same time next night. She still heard nothing, but she saw me walk to the bedroom and get ready for bed. She didn't tell me until I was 14, so that I wouldn't be scared. Over time, I started to whistle with the man. I would imitate it perfectly, and I knew almost instinctively when to do it. It's like when you wake up to the same time alarm, so often you wouldn't sleep in even if you wanted to. I started to do this during my senior year, so I didn't really notice when the whistling got closer. I still don't know why for sure, but I think it was because that's when I seriously started thinking about colleges. During my senior year, there was some family drama, and I had to move back in with my father for a few months, and it seemed like something was missing, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It wasn't the whistling itself, but the feeling of being watched that always accompanied it. I had gotten so used to it that I didn't realize how uneasy it really made me feel. After I turned 18, I moved back into the house alone. My mum got arrested, nothing crazy, don't worry, and she was gone for 4 months and wanted me to stay and watch the house. This whole thing put me off school, so I spent most of my time either working or focusing on getting my GED. This is when things got weird. I never thought of the man as a bad spirit in any sense. I had almost come to see him as a guardian angel. I made up a name for him, Gregory, and his dog, was socks. It was about January of this year, freshly 19, with a GED and big dreams of college, that I realized just how sinister things were. Only I could hear the whistle. The amount of sleepovers I had, where I was the one getting ready for bed too early, definitely proves it. It was only outside my window. If I were at any other spot in the house, I wouldn't hear it. It had slowly moved closer to the window over the years as well. I used to be on the street, before I realized it had crossed the grassy slope from the sidewalk to the brick foundation that my house sat on. The night I applied for my new college, I got in, and I'm transferring in next fall, I heard a tap. I've got some crappy friends and thick blinds, so I went over and swung them open fast to spook whatever arsehat tried to spook me, but I saw nothing. It was getting dark, and the sunset over the ocean was bright red. Unusual, but nothing alarmed me. But what I saw in the sunset definitely terrified me. There he was, his head cocked and just staring out from the outside wall beside my large front-to-ceiling window. Only for a moment. It was almost like when something flashes on a screen for 1/10 of a second, and you kinda remember it, but you didn't have enough time to really process it. The face was pale, and his eyes were thin with age, but still intense. He had no facial hair. His eyebrows were thick and wiry, and when I blinked, I saw him like a brand on the back of my lids. I was shaken. The encounter felt like a warning. Why, on God's green earth, would the man that has been alongside me for so long try to hurt me? I almost felt betrayed. He had become the one constant, but now when I look back on what I perceived to be a comforting caregiver, I am only met with an uneasy stomach and the beginnings of a headache. This was just the beginning. Every night he tapped on my window, and every night I jumped. I was still living alone and didn't want to call anyone about it. I was crazy, absolutely batshit bonkers, and I knew it. I felt isolated and alone, unable to go anywhere but the place I feared most. My friends had either moved away for college or were staying with their parents, so I couldn't ask them for help, or my family would lock me up. There's been a history of bipolar disorder in my family, and they shunned her for it. If it came forwards about talking about a ghost man that I named Gregory and his dog at my window, they'd laugh. It seems funny from an outsider's perspective, really. I started taking the graveyard shift and doing night classes that cost me more than they were worth. I stopped having friends over because of course they were going to hang at my place, where there was never anyone to bother our hooligan asses. I was so lonely for about 2 months. I started having panic attacks when I would look outside at work to see the sun setting. One particular night, it was so bad that my boss called after my concerned co-worker contacted her and said that I needed to go home. It was the last thing I wanted, but this fear was making me physically sick, so I decided to grow some balls and stand in front of my open window at 7:43 exactly. I stood there with chills up my back and waited. After moments of tense, staticky silence, I turned to look at the clock in confusion. It was 7:45. There was nothing. No whistling, no tapping, and definitely no face. I felt triumphant. I was almost cocky when I really did nothing. I felt like I had conquered Gregory and Socks. Just as I was coming down from victory high, I heard what sounded like long nails on my hardwood floor. It almost sounded like my dogs, but I had put them in the backyard to do their business, and neither of them were big enough to make that almost galloping sound. I couldn't see anything with my eyes, but I felt the fear of an animal running towards me at full speed, the hesitation between a heartbeat. I had nowhere to run, but I knew I had to do something. I could feel the ominous and dreary presence of the man coming from just outside the door inside my hallway, and the threat of a feral dog I knew was in front of me but couldn't see. For a moment, everything went quiet again, and I almost forgot how to breathe. I felt the presence leave. "I own you, Zoe." It was clear as day, and right in my ear. I could almost feel the breath rustle my hair. I broke down crying. I had never felt so helpless in my entire life. This thing that watched me grow and go through crappy puberty years and breakups and terrible family drama knew everything about me. I had let this dead man dictate my life for so long. He got into my head. I rented a shitty motel room for the next few weeks with my pups. I didn't recommend putting 2 dwarf pit bulls in a hotel room. And when I finally came back, the whistling was back on the street, accompanied by the sound of paws on concrete. This story terrifies me to my core. I'm in the city that I'll call home for a few more months to meet with my leasing agent. But right now, I'm going home tomorrow and can feel that familiar sensation of what I can only describe as heartbreak and a loss of control seep back in. I don't want to go back. I found this place to share this story, and it felt like one of the few places I could ask my advice. I tried sage, and even had my deep Christian friend come over and say prayers at my doorway. I guess that's a thing. I don't know. Please, I need help. This isn't a lie, and it's not a story. I am terrified to go home to that empty house. But I'm saving for an apartment and travel expenses and tuition, so I can't go to a motel. I really and genuinely don't know what to do. Anything will be helpful. I'm moving in January, but Gregory got so close to me, and I have heard that in order to hear something that clearly is from the dead, means that he is strong. My mother and stepfather bought a house in a 70s-era suburb in the late 90s. I was about 13 at the time and already having a lot of issues with depression. Typical teenager stuff. Things were tense between my older brother and my stepdad, and I wasn't having the best time with parents in general either. So we moved into this house. It seemed fine. I had already had some unexplained experiences prior to this in other houses we lived in for as far back as I can remember, and I was looking forward to perhaps not having to deal with that again. Oh man, it did not go down like that. The first thing I remember was one night around 5 or 6. My parents hadn't come home from work yet. It was dark out already, being winter in Canada, and I was sitting in the living room on the main floor and started hearing muffled voices talking. It sounded like an old man and a little girl having a conversation. I could hear the gravelly tone of his voice and the high-pitched sing-song quality of hers. But as usual in these stories, I couldn't tell what exactly they were saying. I walked to the basement stairs and leaned over the railing to see what was going on. Where was it coming from? It was definitely from down there, where the dark, creepy laundry and storage room was. "Hello?" I yelled down. The voices ceased immediately. Good enough. I had no interest to investigate. It happened a few more times, only when I was alone at night. This didn't really scare me. It could be worse, right? So yeah, it got worse. As my mental health started slipping further into depression land, my experiences became interesting. More than once, I would hear extremely loud pounding in the laundry room. It sounded like someone was throwing haymakers at the washing machine, trying to punch a hole through it. Just that hollow, metallic bang, 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 over and over again. The first time it happened, it scared the cap out of me. I'm not easily startled, but it was so loud and so intense that I had to go check. The terrific pounding didn't stop until I made it down the basement stairs and stood in the doorway of the laundry room. Then it stopped immediately. I turned on the light, checked the laundry machine, and they were empty and not running. I even called my mum to ask about it. She said no one was doing laundry and it was probably nothing. The second time it happened, again I was alone. I ran down to check. This time, I was gonna figure it out. Nope, same story. It stopped as soon as I got to the door. The sound was violent and extremely loud, and I was not impressed. So I told it to shut the hell up and went back upstairs. It didn't happen again after that. So awesome. I sure told it, right? No. I was talking on the cordless phone to one of my friends. We had been chatting for about a half hour when all of a sudden this loud static noise cuts off the conversation, and a guttural voice sounded like it was gargling and talking unintelligibly for about 10 seconds, with loud static accompanying the whole time. Then it cut out, and I was back with my friend. She immediately asked, "What the hell was that?" And I nearly crapped myself. I didn't think she would hear it on her end, but she absolutely did, and described it to me before I said anything to her. So that's cool. Right on. No biggie. One night she came over to sleep. Because my parents were out of town, and because of my crippling depression, they didn't trust me by myself. So they greenlit her for staying over. Everything was normal until next morning. She slept on the couch in the living room, and I slept in my bed. I got up to go to the bathroom when I woke up that morning. When I finished and came out, I went into my room to change. On my dresser, one of my candles was lit. My friend was still sleeping on the couch, and she was not the type to play pranks. I wasn't scared about ghosts at that point. I was just pissed that something started a fire. That's just dangerous, and no one would believe me if I said I didn't do it. So I was miffed. I told whatever it was that it can't be starting fires, house rules, and it never happened again. Many times I would be laying in bed at night, staring into the dark, not able to sleep. The dark plays tricks, I know this, but this was still a little weird to me. I heard shuffling in my closet, like someone was going through a box of my stuff. The closet door was open, and I was looking in. It was dark, but I could see something on the top shelf moving. I turn on the light, and there's nothing. This occurrence kept happening at least once every week. I once woke up in the middle of the night freezing. My blankets were down by my feet, which in itself isn't that unusual. So I just grab and pull it up, but it didn't work. I yanked hard on them, and it felt like the blanket was caught perhaps. I used all my strength to pull the goddamn blanket and it wouldn't budge. At that point I got scared and decided to go back to sleep without the blanket. I didn't open my eyes during the entire ordeal, and I didn't want to. After that night, I felt my blanket slowly being pulled off me a few times, and I snatched it right back as soon as it started. Not today, asshole. So many times in the night I would wake up startled and see someone standing at the end of my bed. Whoever it was had long hair, I assume, as the head, neck and shoulders weren't defined, but it sure was male. He was huge, 6'4" and beefy. I could only ever see the silhouette, but it was always the same one. Once I watched it rise like it was coming out of the floor. That was interesting. I just rolled over and closed my eyes. Whatever, dude, creep away, I'm tired. It wasn't just the house either. It felt like it was the entire neighborhood that was a little touched. I'd go on walks at night to stabilize myself and keep myself out of trouble, but also to smoke weed and cigarettes, or drink. So I'm walking down a cement path that goes behind people's houses, like a dog walking path. People's back gates would open onto this path, and you can walk all over the neighborhood without really hitting any streets. It was like a back path maze. About 2 houses down from mine, these people had a wooden gate and a set of about 3 stairs to go into the yard. I'd sit on those stairs a lot and just smoke and chill, trying to center myself mentally. One night, I was going to sit on them as normal, and I got close enough to see. It looked like there was a 2-year-old sitting on the stairs. I got weirded out, because what the hell is a kid at that age doing alone outside at this time of night? I got closer and noticed that this kid didn't have a friggin' head. I could see him sitting there, his hands on his lap, overall striped shirt, and nothing above his neck. He was solid like a real person, and I could see the neck meat where it looked like his head was severed. No blood though, so I kept walking. There were parks within stumbling distance of my house that all connected to each other. The first park had a playground, the next one it connected to had an elementary school, and the third was just trees and grass. So I'm walking home at 11 p.m. Snow on the ground at -20 Celsius. Low clouds, so the light of the city reflected back and illuminated everything better than a full moon ever could. It was damn near daylight out there, and I could see from one end of the park to the other. At the furthest end, I saw a black form moving quickly. I figured it was a cat or rabbit or something, and then a second, and then a third. I started getting worried it was coyotes. They moved fast and were definitely running. They crossed back and forth and began heading in my direction. They crossed over each other as they got closer, and over the span of about 10 seconds, they had gotten about halfway to me. Then they disappeared. At first, I thought maybe they dove under some new snow, or something like that. But the entire time I didn't hear a sound, no paw on crunchy snow, no animal calls, nothing. After that, I started getting a really bad feeling any time I even looked into the park from the street. Fast forward to when I was 23, and had to move back there after screwing up my life. I ended up having to stay in the bedroom in the basement, as they had converted my old room into a study. I'm sitting at my desk reading, when I hear something rustling in my closet. Ah, memories. It seriously sounded like there was a raccoon tossing things looking for food. So I get up and turn on the light. The noise persists, which confused me, as I'm used to things stopping when I take notice. So I go into the closet and start hauling everything out, convinced I was going to find a mouse or something. The entire time I searched that closet, these noises continued, and after hauling the last thing out and scouring for signs of poop or holes, the noises finally stopped. I have many other stories about places I've lived in, but these have been some of the more intense. I come from a military family, and as such, I lived all over the country, often unable to keep friends for any period. I also have insane social anxiety, so I'm overall pretty bad at making friends to begin with. This story starts after I lived in rural Newfoundland for about 3 years, at age 14. I have no friends. My home life is pretty terrible, and I was at this point pretty depressed. I lived on about an acre of land, with a river separating us from about 1 million acres of raw forest that had a bunch of ATV trails in it. It was a spooky forest, and I have tons of stories about what I saw in there that makes most horror movies look like a joke. Of note is the Bear Trap Forest, the 40-foot swamp, the random abandoned suburb, and the house in the middle of nowhere. But these are tales for another time. It was around late August. My parents had told me for many weeks now there had been hoots and hollers coming from our backyard. They had seen flashlights and thought it was just some kids trying to break into our garage and steal some beer. There had been times, and I'd heard it too, normally in the evening, of just a couple of voices periodically hollering, and often I heard several voices speaking from just across the river in the woods. No big deal. A lot of kids hung out in those woods, and due to my oppressive social anxiety, I sure as hell didn't have any desire to talk to them. After this happened for some weeks, I heard the kids doing their usual thing around 4 in the afternoon, and decided, you know what? I'm gonna see what's so amusing. So I ventured into the woods, and go maybe about 300 feet in an ATV trail my neighbor used, and I met one of them. I'm going to use their names, as it will give some context. The kid I met was called Jack. He was a year or two younger than me, about a foot shorter and wearing some really out-of-date clothes. He seemed kind of surprised to meet me, but we said our hellos. I said I had heard them for a while now, and came to see what was happening. Jack got super pumped, and insisted I follow him to his friend's project. So I follow the guy, and am taken into an area that is pretty clear-cut, in a dense path of woods. I knew this area. I hung out in the woods alone a lot, and explored, and this was brand new. There were 2 other kids there, one my age named Elvis, and another older kid by about 2 years called Louis. They said they were working on a treehouse/fort, and wondered if I would be interested in helping. I of course said yes. I had never been asked to hang out with anyone, and they showed me around. Now, I need to discuss these kids' clothes. When I say out of style, I'm talking early 80s miserable fashion. Neon colors, one kid had shoulder pads, and was a mess. They wore big rubber boots, and the kids looked, I want to say, new, like they had no signs of pimples. Their hair was immaculate, their clothes crisp as hell. I had just assumed they were hand-me-downs from their parents or something, as they stated that they were all friends, not brothers. So these kids were nice to me, and I mean really nice. I never really got to know them. They never wanted to talk about their home life, but that isn't surprising where I lived. We used hatchets, saws, ropes, and nails to make a pretty solid fort. Had about 8-foot walls made of birch trees, and we made a table to sit at. A lookout post in the biggest tree that we could find. The place was about the size of a 1-bedroom apartment, and we were all pretty proud. One day, we were sitting at the table, talking about our favorite trees or something, and I asked Elvis why I'd never seen him around before. If he lived near me, he had to go to my school. It was one of 2 schools in the town, and no way he lived in the catchment area of the other one. He insisted he did, and wondered why he'd never met me either. We didn't know the same classmates, same people, and could barely agree on teachers. But whatever. These kids talked to me, and that was enough. So about 2 weeks after meeting them and building this fort, on one of these days I said I needed to go home and get something to eat. I asked if they wanted something too, as this was basically my backyard and my parents always made way too much food. They became downright hostile. Not over the food, they just refused to cross the river, adamantly. Louis came up with the story about how crossing a stranger's river is bad luck, but I sure wasn't pushing the issue. I asked if they wanted something, and they said yes, and I brought back a pie that we could all eat. They apologized about getting angry, said they were just very superstitious, and I thought nothing more of it. We had a good rest of the day planning to invade the woods looking for some thick pine trees. Cut to about a week later. I had went to the fort and we did our thing, but today the kids looked haggard. Jack was particularly bad. He looked like he had just gotten the beat down of his life while catching pneumonia 3 times over. I asked if he was okay. He said he just had flu. But they also looked wet, maybe greasy is a better word. They had sick hair. Their skin was all shiny and clammy, and their clothes looked like arse. I wasn't shocked. These kids wore the same clothes pretty much every day, but so did a lot of the really poor kids in town. We played around for an hour or so before they left, with Louis saying he would see me tomorrow, as Jack and Elvis walked away coughing like they'd smoked a pack a day. I had told my parents about these kids. They thought they were weird, but a kid with no friend just found 3, so don't ask questions. The nighttime hollering had stopped at this point, and we never did see the flashlights again. So the next day I went back with a hatchet, a bag of nails in hand, as the plan was that we were going to give the lookout a roof. When I come to the fort, the place is wrecked. The walls had been torn down. The table was in half, and the lookout had maybe 1 or 2 pieces left to it. Most notably, everything was rotting, like it had been sitting there for decades, rotting. The table was basically nothing, and I could see growth in what had been our floor. Solid, half-tree growth. My only thought was, what the hell? And I rationalized that maybe someone found out about the fort and wrecked it. So I waited for the kids to come. Next day, and the next day, and the day after that. I waited a week but never did see those kids again. I was pretty dejected, and eventually I stopped trying to wait for them. I wanted to look for them, but they had never shown me or told me where they lived, other than up the hill. My parents noticed and asked me why I wasn't hanging out with the kids anymore. I told them what was happening, and they dismissed it and just insisted that they probably didn't want to be my friend, that I didn't need them. I was sad for a good while after that. Cut to today. I'm 29, and telling my wife about these kids I used to hang out with. And this time, we made a call forward. I explained how they look, how they acted, and it's overall a pretty good memory with a sad ending. My wife looks at me wide-eyed and said, "You hang out with a bunch of spooky ghost kids." I find this crazy, but she says, "Did anyone else see them?" And no, they didn't. They saw a flashlight, but not the kids. They heard them, and they heard about them, but no one had ever laid an eye on them other than me. There were never any records I could find about them. No one else in the school they supposedly went to knew them, and they never showed me their house or came to mind despite my insistence. My wife said it was some spooky stuff, and that I should probably share it with all of you. What do you guys think? When I was growing up in the 60s on Long Island, I adored my Aunt Elizabeth. She's my dad's baby sister, 12 years younger and 17 years older than me. She was a flight attendant for a major carrier and lived in an apartment in the city with a classic Italian beauty, petite with beautiful olive skin, green eyes, and jet black hair. She doted on me, and I loved the pictures and gifts that she'd bring for me from other parts of the country, and sometimes even Europe. When I got older, my parents would let me go visit her apartment, where she and her equally gorgeous and glamorous friends would smoke cigarettes, drink cocktails, and play records and talk about glamorous and adult things together. And I would feel sophisticated and cool merely by being in the room. One day, when she was 30, she was called in sick to work. Thinking she had the flu, it turned out to be meningitis, and she was dead within 2 days. What followed were the saddest events of my childhood. One of 3 times I saw my father cry, big, racking sobs, was as he was dressing for the wake. I remember Aunt Elizabeth laid out at the wake, wearing her flight attendant uniform, still beautiful. I remember how soft and lovely the cream-colored satin lining her casket felt. So many people came to her funeral that people just spilled out on the sidewalk next to our little suburban Catholic church. Sunday dinners with my grandparents and aunts and uncles never felt the same. Ironically, this niece of a flight attendant from the golden age of air has always been terrified of air travel. I used to travel quite frequently for work, and on some long-haul flights I would be unable to cope without the help from a whole bottle of red wine in Ambien. A few months ago, I decided I want to drop that. It's not exactly healthy. So on my first flight across the country in a while, I took 10 milligrams of melatonin, sat in my seat anxiously, and tried to fall asleep. Eventually I did, and what followed were terrifying dreams. Of course, it would take place on the same flight, and of course the cabin pressure would drop, and of course the plane would be plummeting, and I was about to die crashing into a cornfield. As everyone panicked and screamed, I saw a flight attendant walking down the aisle to my seat, and it was my Aunt Elizabeth. She was walking calmly and intently with a little sly smile on her face, as if I were an old friend of hers who she hadn't seen in a long time. She was wearing the same flight attendant uniform she was buried in, but her legs and feet were bare. She came, looked at me, took my left hand in hers and said, "It'll be okay, honey. It really will. Things can look bad, and sometimes it gets a little turbulent, but the pilot will right it." And then said, "How are you?" I sputtered out the first thing that came to mind if asked, "What have you done with your life since age 13? I think I mentioned where I went to school, and something about my first job, something about cell phones and how much she would have loved them. I said my dad had passed, but my mum and sister were doing fine. I talked about how ridiculous rents were in the city, and about the changes that had happened to our hometown. As I was babbling, I noticed the plane returning to normal, the pressure coming back, people calming down, and the dream ended shortly before everything returned to normality. Aunt Elizabeth's hand on my shoulder. I woke up 30 minutes before landing. I was so stunned by this dream. I hadn't really thought about Aunt Elizabeth or about her in detail for years. I had a few minutes, so I called my mother and told her what happened. I mentioned that I thought it strange that in the dream she was barefoot while working on the plane, and my mother paused and said, "Elizabeth was buried barefoot. Apparently, it's custom in the little corner of Sicily that my father's family comes from for women to be buried barefoot when laid to rest, and they'd adhere to it when burying Aunt Elizabeth and my grandmother many years later. I would not have known, as the lower lid of her casket was closed during the wake. I'm not even religious, but that made me truly believe that my Aunt Elizabeth came to visit me and comfort me during a time of stress and fear, or something like her, a piece of her. It was wonderful and moving to realize this, like a warm blanket around me. I suddenly recalled memories of my aunt that I didn't even know I had. I was in tears in an airport bathroom. I've been through a lot in my life. Some moves, unemployment, 2 divorces, losing a house, and getting one back. Friends and family dying. But for a few moments in a dream I got to see someone who I loved and who loved me when I was a little girl, excited for the big world ahead of her. I love you, Aunt Elizabeth. Visit again, anytime. I was 10 or 11 years old and was sleeping in my grandma's guest bedroom. Next to the bed was an antique easy chair. When I woke up next morning, I looked over towards the chair, and sitting there was a little girl. She had dark hair that was done up in pigtails and tied by a blue ribbon. She wore an old-fashioned dress of the early 1900s, and initially, I was startled to see her. I was even more startled to see through her. She just looked at me and smiled. She did a small wave and mouthed the words, "Hello." I said hello back, and she faded. That was my first experience with a ghost. Months later, it was Easter Sunday. My sister and I were staying the night at my grandma's house so that we could receive our Easter basket and hunt for eggs. I woke up early to get a peek at the Easter baskets. I slipped out of bed and walked quietly to the living room. The early morning sunshine was brightly streaming through the windows and into the living room. Sitting on the couch was the little girl. I smiled and waved hello again, and she smiled and waved back. I told her it was great to see her, and she emphatically nodded that it was good to see me too. My grandma must have heard me talking to someone because she woke up and told me to go back to bed, that it was still far too early to hunt for eggs. I looked at my grandmother and then back at the couch. The little girl was gone. That was the last time I saw the little girl with the blue ribbons in her hair. My grandma moved from there shortly after into a new place. However, my friend Melissa ended up moving into where my grandma lived, and she claims to have seen the little girl with the ribbons in her hair. During the same period, my mum's sister and I were all living in a trailer on my great-uncle Wilbert's property, a large cattle ranch. We were staying there while my dad was stationed in Okinawa, Japan. On this property in the mid-80s, Uncle Wilbert had built a 2-story building. Everybody called it the tower. Windows faced each direction on the top floor. The largest one faced towards Highway 99. Wilbert believed that you could learn much from observing the 99. In the evening, he would often go up to the tower, watch TV, and keep watch over the cattle. In the lower portion of the tower is where my family kept our clothes and food. One night, Mum had instructed my sister and I to go to the bottom of the tower to pick out our breakfast for the next morning. Tricia was in the middle of doing something, so I offered to grab breakfast for her. I entered the bottom floor of the tower, chose a handful of Pop-Tarts, and above me I could hear the TV. So I assumed Uncle Wilbert was up in the tower. I stepped out the bottom half and looked up towards the large window to see if Wilbert was there. The TV was, but Wilbert wasn't in the tower. Instead, there was a family. A mother, father, little girl and boy. I thought that it was strange they were up there as Wilbert hardly ever had visitors. Another strange thing was that they weren't watching a TV. Instead, they were sitting on the couch and staring out the window towards Highway 99. They didn't move. They were all sitting with perfect posture and hands settled on their laps. Even though I thought it was unusual, I just returned to the trailer and didn't say anything to my mum about it. The next day, I asked Uncle Wilbert who his guests were, and he looks at me with a confused look on his face. He hadn't had any guests last night, and nobody by that description. Who were those people? A few months after that, I had gone down to the bottom of the tower again to grab my breakfast for the next morning. I went in, grabbed some oatmeal, and as I was closing the door behind me, I looked up to the landing that leads to the door on the top floor. Looking over the landing was a woman dressed in a white flowing dress. She herself was as white as the dress, and the woman's hair and dress blew in a non-existent wind. She looked down at me. She smiled, did a slow, long, graceful wave, and despite this friendly gesture, I was terrified. She reminded me of the depiction of banshees that I had seen in movies. I ran back to the trailer and told my mum about what I'd seen. She exited the trailer and took the stairs up to the top of the tower. She opened the tower door and no one was there. We knew the lady couldn't have gotten down the stairs because the windows on the trailer faced directly towards the stairway, and we didn't see anyone come down. Most of the friends of the family know that the tower is haunted. I believe that it sits on some kind of vortex. Though my family no longer lives on the property, I still see spirits from time to time. I call them my visitors. I don't try and communicate with them, nor they me. They just appear, and as quickly as they come, they are gone. There is a ghost cat in my family. Surprisingly, we refer to it as Ghost Cat. It's an itty-bitty, just out of kittenhood tuxedo cat, with a little extra white facial fur. It died around 1992 or so. I have a sister with a strong penchant for narcotics, and she was staying in the third-floor loft at my mum's spindly old Victorian-era home when she brought home this kitten. She had it for long enough for it to have discovered how to escape downstairs to the kitchen, where my mother noticed and would feed it. Then it suddenly stopped. Knowing my sister and fearing the worst, my mum went looking and found the poor little thing. It had gotten into the storage/attic side of the third floor, went exploring under a loose floorboard, got trapped, and sadly perished. I was home visiting at the time as I'd moved out of state and helped bury it. Apparently, we'd forgotten to tell it that it died because when I was home to visit the next year, it visited me. I'd gone to sleep in the spare room, making sure that Mum's crazy, sex-crazed, and somewhat vicious old intact tomcat Jack was not locked in with me. I climbed into bed, turned off the nightstand light, and settled back to sleep. And a little something undeniably cat-like jumps on the bed. Being a bit groggy and having cats of my own, it takes me a second for me to be concerned. But I'd woken up before with Jack, fastened to a leg by claw and teeth, going to town like a jackhammer. So I flipped the light on and hunted for him, intent to throw him out. No cat. Off with the light, back under the covers. Was mostly asleep when I felt a little thump of a small cat on the bed. I turn on the light, and there's nothing there. I mention it the next morning and am told the little kit that I buried the previous year wasn't at rest. It supposedly would jump in bed with Mum, play and chase back and forth with Jack, and occasionally be seen watching curiously over the household goings-on. In other words, just being a cat. I didn't believe it much then, but over the years it stopped by when I came home to visit. When Mum got ill enough to swallow her pride, cancer, I came home and couldn't deny there was a little spirited cat in the house. Well, I could. It's just always at the line, you know, where it's deniable. When Mum sadly passed, Ghost Cat roamed up and down the stairs loudly. It was the first time I saw the little thing, and it slept in my bed that night too. It shared space with my then girlfriend, now wife, and our cats, after we took up residence there for about a year, and when we moved and started setting up Mum's estate. I'd see it out of the corner of my eye as I did repairs or packed family memorabilia. I went back over not long ago, checking pipes against the cold. Electricity off, so I was working with a flashlight. They were new owners, a nice couple expecting their first kid, to take possession the following month. And just outside the flashlight beam was this little tuxedo kitty. Just vague enough that I couldn't swear I saw it, but enough that I knew it was there. So I told it while working. This wasn't its home anymore, and it should come home with me. It was about a week later, the night before last, that I felt an extra cat thump onto the bed. I think maybe it's wishful thinking, but I'm pretty sure Ghost Cat has moved with us now. I'm hoping, anyway. Last night, I went to go spend the night at my girlfriend's apartment. I got to her apartment around 12:30 a.m. and locked the doors and turned all the lights off, because she was already asleep in her room. I laid down and fell asleep with her almost immediately. Around 1:30 a.m., we were both kind of half conscious because she had switched sleeping positions and kissed me, and not even a minute or two later, we were both simultaneously woken up by a loud-ass voice that came from the open door of her room. That was a deep male voice saying, "Fool." That's all I can remember, because my adrenaline kicked in and I was ready to fight if someone was in the apartment with us. Neither of us can remember exactly what was said, aside from it being super loud. Honestly, I was scared, and there was someone in the apartment with us. I immediately threw my hand over my girlfriend's mouth because she was freaking out about the scream, because I knew she thought there was someone in the apartment with us as well. I looked at her and motioned for her to be quiet, as I got up and turned all the lights on and searched the entire apartment. There was nothing. All of the doors were still locked, and I checked everywhere any person could hide, and found nothing. I tried to lay out all the facts after this happened, but I've concluded that it had to have been some sort of entity. Other facts that I've paid attention to while trying to debunk this: you can hear the neighbors throughout the entire building, but only while they're screaming or stomping around, and even then it's always muffled because it's coming through the floor or walls. So it couldn't have been that because of how loud this voice was, so it eliminates that possibility. The window was open in her room because it was hot in her room, and I've even looked outside and there were 0 footprints around the window. We live in Upper Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and we have a lot of snow. This eliminates that factor. My girlfriend's dog was sleeping between my legs when we heard this voice, and she was dead asleep when I got up to check what the hell it was. So that eliminates the possibility of it being the dog. We've both been pretty bewildered by this encounter. I spent the night there again recently, and found that her closet door, which we had confirmed had been closed before we went to sleep, was found wide open. This was only due to what I encountered seconds before, which was feeling someone's hand on my pillow next to my face. I could feel the pressure it made, and it made me wake up. I looked at the pillow, and there was an imprint of what appeared to be a large hand. When I was observing the pillow, I had noticed the closet door was wide open, and my girlfriend's dog was laying on the floor staring at it. I don't know what it means, but I know something is going on, and I need to get to the bottom of it. Some years ago, the organization I work for had a printing department which had a warehouse/distribution office that was situated several miles from the main office. We had a crew of about 12 people working there. There was a rumor going around that this building was haunted. At first I didn't believe the rumors. Then slowly, stories got out from staff members who worked at the office. They said they often heard the sound of children running around the warehouse at night, but it would be completely empty when they went to check. Some claimed that they would see and hear furniture being moved when they worked at night. Later, the disturbance grew more insistent, with people being touched by unseen hands, things going missing and turning up at random places. One person claimed that she was pressed against the wall by something invisible and big. It all came to a head when someone got badly hurt. A colleague was clearing a few late deliveries late one evening before clocking out. He was at the main office on the second floor. When he was done, he locked the office up and headed downstairs to clock out. As he was in the landing at the top of the stairs, he said something pushed him hard. He flew down the top stairs, then rolled down the other half of the staircase. His screams brought security guards running. They found him at the bottom, in a pool of blood. The ambulance and paramedics were called. My colleague and friend was in bad shape. He had a cracked skull, a broken arm, a broken leg, a massive concussion, and was bleeding from his head. He was unconscious. They carefully got him into the ambulance and took him into the emergency room. He did not regain consciousness for a few more days. It was scary because the doctors weren't sure if he would have brain damage until they could assess his responses. When he woke up, he told us what happened. He said something had pushed him. They checked the CCTV and saw him go down the stairs, then suddenly flew forwards down the stairs. An investigation was done, but they found nothing that could prove that he tripped. Eventually, he got better, and he never went to work on the stairs alone again. Stories of minor disturbances continued until we sold off the building. It's still standing. Now it's the headquarters of some charity organization. The video still exists. According to the security guy, they keep it under lock and key, along with several other videos that show weird things happening in the building. Perhaps someday I'll be able to get my hands on them. I too feature in a few of them, but those are less exciting stories. Currently my boys are 8 and 6. At the time, they were 4 and 2. We had been living in a place for about 5 to 6 months, and my oldest, who isn't firing on any cylinders to be honest, kept walking to the corner, looking up and talking. He was still doing a lot of babbling until he was almost 6, and then after a few times he walked over, grabbed his younger brother by the hand, walked him to the corner, and he also looked up, started talking, and they were both smiling and giggling, like an adult was interacting with them. After my youngest's 3rd trip over, I asked, "What in the world are you two doing?" thinking it was some kind of game. My oldest giggled and said, "I'm talking to Grandpa." I'm confused. "Baby, your grandpa lives in Nebraska. He's very far away." My child looks at me and replies, "No, Mummy, it's your grandpa." As I said, my oldest was still doing a lot of babbling, so for him to suddenly speak so clearly and in a complete coherent thought was very unnerving. I look at the corner. Both my boys are talking and showing toys up to the corner. I watch for a few minutes. This all happened over a grand total of about half hour. "Babies, come watch your movie so Mum can finish dinner," because little ones have zero logic. The younger one waddles over and sits down. The eldest picks up the toys that had accumulated in the corner and put them away and sat next to his brother. I start dinner and I keep looking at the corner. shot in the dark. Thanks, Grandpa. The door in the corner fell open like someone walked through it, and there was a heightened feeling in the room afterwards. That night, I had a dream of my childhood home, and on the path back to the woods there was a small building, granite like a mausoleum, but was little more than an awning. One wall that held a door, 4 pillars, and a bench swing. I walked to it and lit an incense and sat on the swing and started rocking, staring at the ground. Then, there they were, those old ratty sneakers. My grandpa was sitting next to me with that smile, sitting on the swing. I just started talking, mostly about the boys. I told him I missed him so much that I named my oldest after him. He just sat and listened with that smile on his face. After a while, we both stood up. I hugged him and told him I hadn't told him everything yet. Then my name was called from somewhere. I looked around, didn't see anyone, but I looked back and he was gone. I yanked the door open, and it went into this vertical shaft, endless in both directions, completely lined with doors. I woke up crying amidst a panic attack. My grandfather died in about 2005, my grandmother in 2008, and my son was born in 2010, just 1 week shy of my grandfather's birthday, which happened to be the day the doctor scheduled me to originally be induced. My father's dad was a dog trainer. He had a huge room where he would train golden retrievers. One day he sent my father a golden overseas, as he lived across the country. When he got him, he was overjoyed. He was a beautiful boy and would prance around and love to play in the water. One thing he'd do was chew the legs of tables and other furniture, so my dad called him Chewy. Many people assumed he was named after Chewbacca, but this simply wasn't the case. When my parents adopted me, this dog was my companion. In pictures, I can see how protective he actually was. He was a really great dog in general. He loved the snow, and he was family. That's when we got the devastating news that he had heart disease and would last no more than a few years. Those years were golden. We did everything for his needs, and then he was gone. Now, this experience happened last night, and I will never forget it. Right now, I'm 17 and was adopted at the age of 2. It was probably midnight. I put my dog into my room, and I walk out into the hall, and when I turned, I could see an outline of Chewy. I could see his big black eyes, and his fur was as golden as could be. He was smiling, as any golden retriever would do, and I felt an overwhelming sense of joy and happiness, and I just smiled before walking into my room. Now, before this even happened, I always had a feeling he was laying in my room, even though my dog of right now, Baxter, was as well. When I first got my new dog, he would always look into the corner where Chewy used to lay, and from then on, I knew that Chewy would always be with me. I've had plenty of weird and unexplainable experiences, but this one is the only one that I find difficult putting into words. When I was around 6, I remember whenever I found myself alone, I used to see a man in my house always behind me, in corners, behind the sofa I was sitting on. This happened for years. This thing was very human-like. There was not a faded or blurred line, and this thing would always be wearing the same clothes when I saw it. I would catch glimpses of it, and as soon as I turned around it would be gone, as if nothing were there. I remember as a child it didn't scare me as much as it should have, but I was always super cautious and uneasy. It never made me run crying to my parents though. What is weird is that at this time I recognized the man. In my head, the man was my uncle/family friend who I thought was very much alive. So everything I saw, I put down to my imagination. A few years go by and I kept on seeing this. What I realized was that I never saw this man in real life. There were no pictures of him, never any meeting with families. So how could I possibly have this feeling that I knew him? How could my brain invent this character and backstory for him? I was asking around for this unidentified uncle, and it seems he never really existed. I looked at the family photos of the family who I thought were his, and nothing. Unfortunately, my father passed a few years ago, and since I've been trying to find photos of him, I came across a photo of my dad and his dad, my grandfather, who I'd never met. And the man I used to see looks a lot like him, but not an 100% match. My memories have obviously faded because of how long ago it was, but I know it's only in resemblance and not who I used to see as a child. A few years ago, this happened to a friend. He was on vacation at his grandfather's place in a rural area, basically the middle of nowhere, with the closest neighbor being kilometers away from them. Like with any countryside building, there is no proper plumbing in the house, so the restroom was just outside. It was about 3 a.m., the night pitch black, when my friend decided to go to the restroom. Using his torch on his phone, he made his way to find it, did his thing, and right before leaving he took a photo. He had opened the restroom door ajar to take a snap on Snapchat of all the darkness surrounding him. The idea was to show all the friends how brave he was in the dark alone. He almost dropped his phone because the latter wasn't true. In the picture there was a door on the left with the empty void just next to it. But in the dark, if you look, it seems like a couple is standing facing the camera. The man looks like he's wearing a suit, and the woman in front wearing a red dress. He was really shaken about the image he'd just taken. So, he quickly wrote, "Take a screenshot," and hit send to everyone including me, while trying to muster up the confidence to return back to his house. The explanation? We still don't really know what caused it. It may 100% be an illusion, just under the right angle. It may also be Photoshop, but he hasn't told us it was a joke in all these years. I still have it saved on my desktop, and I still get shivers whenever I see it. So about 6 months after I bought our house, I started noticing something odd. Every once in a while, I would catch sight of something out of the corner of my eye, and always assume it was my cat, since it was the same size and shape, and moved like a cat. However, I would realize a few seconds later that my cat was in the yard or another room. It would try to look back, but nothing was ever there. It was so quick I always dismissed it. Once at night, I saw it on the ceiling, and I about had a heart attack. I would also hear things in the house. I assumed my husband was doing the dishes due to the clinking in the sink, but then I would realize he was in the bedroom, and the kitchen was empty. It took about a year for my husband and I to start wondering aloud if we were actually seeing things, or if something dubious was up. Turns out he was seeing stuff too, just little flashes here and there. My husband said he heard some stuff too on his days off, when no one was home. The biggest moment was when I woke up in the middle of the night and saw my cat curled up on my side table. I heard him purr. His fur looked darker and his purr was lower, but I was half asleep and didn't notice. I went to the bathroom, and on my way I passed my sleeping cat in the hallway. It actually took me a few seconds, but I literally felt my chest turn cold. I went back into my bedroom and saw that the bedside table was empty. We're pretty sure we have a ghost cat in our house. The only thing I know about the previous owners was that he was put into a mental hospital. I've had to routine a bunch of paperwork back over to him over the years because his affairs were very clearly not taken care of when he was hospitalized. My theory is that he had a cat that got lost in the shuffle, and it's still waiting for him to come home. Me and my sister stayed at my mum's a couple of years ago, and we both had to stay in my sister's old room that she always hated. She said spooky stuff used to happen all the time when she was younger, but we just kind of shrugged it off as an overactive imagination. It's about 2 a.m., and we've pretty much talked about anything and everything when I ask if she can turn the light off, since I'm pretty tired and want to sleep. And I kid you not, about 3 minutes after the lights are off, we hear this super low rough growling, like the noise the grudge makes before she attacks. I asked like a 10-year-old, "Was that you?" "No, was that you? Turn the lights on, turn the lights on." Of course, the lamp falls off the dresser as she's trying to turn it on, while we're both in full panic mode. "See, I told you the room is freaky." I laughed nervously, but we slept with the light on that night. Can't even put it down to us being kids. We were in our early 20s. I had other freaky things happen in that room, but I just put it down to lucid dreams. I've always had some kind of affinity with the paranormal. When I was a teenager, I wouldn't stop writing extremely dark, creepy poetry. I have always been a loner. One best friend kind of people, if none. Anyway, onto the story. My parents divorced when I was young, so I became depressed and spent a lot of time alone. We moved in with my grandpa and grandma, and they gave us a little house near them. It was so close that we didn't have to walk 5 meters to reach the other door. My mum always spent time there with them, when I preferred to be alone in our new little house. One time, I was sleeping in the dark there. I dreamed that there was a guy with a black face sitting at the edge of my bed staring at me. I awoke terrified, with that dreadful feeling that there was someone there with me. I snapped out of my place, turned on the lights, and ran to my grandpa's house, and sat beside my grandma and said, "That house can be so creepy." She said, "Of course, 2 guys died there from gas while they were renting the place. We found them a week later." She said it like it was a casual thing to tell, and it was also a slap on the face. That was only a warm-up though. As I got older, my mum remarried, and my grandpa moved to another house of his 150 meters from the previous one. I was left to rot in the old one, living alone for an entire year and a half in my grandpa's old house, which was big, old and creepy, even though their new house wasn't too far from me. But still, I saw stuff there. Shadow people. I remember avoiding most areas in the house. My living consisted in staying in the living room, kitchen and bathroom. The reason was, I always got that eerie feeling of being watched all the time. I was a student finishing my graduation project, so I didn't leave the house that much, except for buying my groceries. There were 2 long hallways in my house. The first led to the bathroom, and the second left to my previous grandparents' room. It was a big room, and it was always locked as they kept their stuff in there. So when you stood in the hallway, you couldn't see the door at the end of it. It was so dark, like an endless hallway of darkness. I always avoided that area. You'd somehow start to feel when something is wrong in these situations. I would always hear banging on the door very late at night, at 2 or 3 a.m. I would brush it off and play courageous since I had no choice. I had to stay in that house, or else I had literally nowhere to live. I was always locking the door to the living room, turning the TV on and trying to fall asleep every night. The door didn't lock all that well, and I'd use a chair as an added measure. One night, I wasn't feeling so good and woke up burning with a fever, almost hallucinating, when I heard the chair move. That's when I saw them. A small, dark, shadowy figure sneaking a peek on me. I couldn't believe my eyes. I got up, switched the light on and looked. The chair moved out of its place to let the door slightly open. I started crying. I called my parents, but none of them answered. To be fair, it was around 3 in the morning. I prayed and tried calming down, convincing myself that I was imagining it. 2 months later, I was watching a video about the jinn on YouTube with loudspeakers. For those of you who don't know, jinn are creatures in the Islamic religion equivalent to demons. The video was called 30 Facts You Didn't Know About Jinns. The last one stated that jinns were living with us, and one of them could probably be watching you right now. I giggled and said, "I'm not scared," but I knew I would regret that later. That same night, I put some Quran readings, since it was supposed to keep the shadow people and jinns away, as per my religion. And I kid you not, at 2 a.m. I woke up to 3 shadow people dancing. One of them was at my feet, another at my head, and the third standing at my face. They were all making a strange noise, almost like static. It was so annoying. I screamed, telling them to leave me alone, and they left, and all was calm. Soon after, I began suffering from insomnia. I couldn't sleep at night anymore. I would spend the night studying, finishing my project, cooking, watching TV, playing video games, and drifting at around 6 a.m. when daylight began peaking. Once, I went to sleep and began dreaming. It was so realistic, it didn't even feel like a dream, and I started hearing some kind of whispers. It's not gentle whispering. It was violent, like a chorus from hell. The closest description would be the soundtrack from Dante's Inferno. Quiet but loud and evil and aggressive. I would hear it in my ears always at the same time, but it was always different. I was still dreaming. I stood up for the source of the sound, and it was at the creepy room at the end of the hallway, which probably became haunted because it wasn't open for too long. I got closer, and there was a man emerging from the darkness. He was bold, short, and had muscular arms. I could even see his veins. He looked right through my soul while he came my way, and I started reciting prayer. At the same time, I heard my cousin screaming at the stairs of the house on my left, telling me to flee. The door was opposite to my left, so I started moving, and it was a struggle, like something was pulling me from the other way. I made it through the open door and got out gasping for air. I thought this thing was chasing me. It's in my house, and I didn't want to go back. That's when I woke up, to the whispering in my ear once more. After a while, my grandparents came to stay for a bit. She would always sleep with the light on at night. I woke up feeling strange, and I kid you not, there was a giant little girl holding something in her left arm. She had the wildest eyes I'd ever seen whilst grinning at me. She was staring right through me and holding a little dwarf kind of guy. He had a tail and greyish skin and was staring at my grandma. I didn't know what to do, so just tried to go back to sleep and ignored them. On another occasion, I was sleeping and actually conversing with someone or something. I thought I was dreaming, but when I opened my eyes, I couldn't see them, but was still arguing with them. "You should let us in. You're done for anyways. Nobody wants you. Your parents left. We're the only ones that will help you now." I was afraid of them. I didn't trust them. What were they saying? They were pressuring me. I was feeling lost, desperate and alone. I opened my eyes and was crying and a mess. Another night, I dreamed that I was in a very big bedroom in a castle, and it was very fancy. The bedroom was very well decorated, and there was an old woman who looked like a cliché witch attending a funeral. She was asking me to let her in. She was very angry, and after a while of making fun of her, she left. And then another one came. This one took her place and was deaf and mute. It was a very strange dream. And after that, my grandma started sleeping in her old bedroom and accused me of running around her bed, throwing stuff at her in the middle of the night, pulling the covers off and the like. I didn't know what she was talking about, but she once woke up screaming, and we found half of her stuff burned beside her candles. No lighters, no fire source, and she left that same night. Fast forward a while. I grew up, graduated, started working and got a job out of the country. I left my current work in the Middle East, and I stay alone in a room in a local housing, and I wake up at 5 a.m. to find white fog in my face. I was covered in it. I stay there for a while, then it turned completely black and vanished. I have no idea what it was. My dad used to work with someone who sent these pictures to him. He says that the guy was a hunter who was using cameras to see wildlife in the area, and was so freaked out by these pictures and other strange occurrences in his house that he wanted to sell his property. It was very strange. Something interesting about these pictures is that apparently there was an ATV accident in these woods and a young woman was killed. The guy living on the property who captured these pictures showed them to a friend who was one of the EMTs at the scene of the accident, and he thought the girl in the picture was dressed similarly to the one who passed away. I have absolutely no idea when this accident occurred or the specifics of the location, so again I can't be sure if this is credible information. I've tried searching for it, but it is all a mystery. I sometimes have precognitive dreams, like my father dying, only to have him fall off a roof and shatter his pelvis and die almost a week later after having the dream. The one that gets me though is the dream where my girlfriend and I were walking through the streets of New York City. Well, it was a world of white, but one New York City building was in this space. A large crowd with their eyes to the sky. We walked up to them and asked them what they're looking at. Someone in the crowd says they're going to jump off the building. My girlfriend and I look up to see a shadowy figure that we can't make out the gender or race of, but it's human. We see this person walk off the edge, and I cover my girlfriend's eyes and close mine whilst turning my head to the floor. All of a sudden, a voice that only I can hear tells me, "I need to watch. There's a reason you need to see this." I watch as this bottom explodes on the ground and I wake up. I also wake up my girlfriend and tell her this story and eventually fall back to sleep. The very next day, meaning the morning after the dream, I go to work and the doorman of the building tells me about a girl who jumped off the building. I asked questions, but he saw it and was obviously in a state of shock from the event. I go home and find out it was an old high school classmate I knew. We weren't in the same circle of friends, but we did have some mutual friends. It was a brand new house. My parents filed to have it built how they wanted it, and finished it in 2001. We got all moved in, and of course everything fit perfectly. After the first month is when things started happening. I was only 7 at the time. My first experience was my mum's, where she would walk out of the room and the TV would turn off, and she would come back in and it would turn on again. But with our old TV, you could hear the piercing buzzing sound shortly after it turned off. Later that week, she heard the volume turn up with one particular song. One of them was her favorite song, and that's how she picked up on it. The first sign she thought there was a ghost is when she set my 1-year-old sister on the bed while she was crying so that she could change. As she turned around, she heard a very clear female voice consoling her, claiming she specifically said, "It's okay, honey, it's all right," in a very motherly way. She passed it off as thinking what she would be saying to her if she weren't having to change. But my sister had calmed down. Then one day while in the kitchen, the TV was turning off and on again, and she got irritated and said out loud, "Okay, if there's someone in here, give me a sign." And not a second later, the cap off the milk jug screwed itself off and fell from the opposite corner to in between her feet. She freaked out and called my dad. My dad's only experience with her is when he saw some wispy shadow thing he described and said it was a girl. She would stand by him either at the foot of her bed or by his side and watch him. One day he woke up to her and finally said, "I can see you," and immediately disappeared. He also said sometimes he saw her walking around and would say the same thing happened when he told her that he could see her. My experience is when I pulled out the drawers to an old dresser. I couldn't put them back in, so I left them out, and came back to the clothes scattered all over the room. I tell my mum, she goes into my room and says out loud, "You can look, but at least put them back." Left the room, came back in later, and the clothes were put away neatly. My older sister's experience is the most interesting. She was cleaning my room because I was too young to do it properly, and I had one of those big brat doll things that could blink and shake her head and had huge feet with a yes and no on them and can talk and was my favorite toy. My sister watched it as it picked up, flew across the corner of the room and landed at a 45-degree angle on its head. Obviously at the time she explained it like this, and she ran screaming, and my mum comes inside and the volume of the radio turns up when she saw she was screaming. We've done research on the piece of land we own, and no one in the neighborhood has had experiences in their house. Turns out the whole place was a Civil War plantation, and our house was in the epicenter. When I was in high school, my parents bought a good-sized house for what they paid. They were aware the house had a history, but none of us were superstitious. The history of the house was that a man had ended his life there. The people who lived in there in the early 80s had rented the basement of the house to their friend. His wife left him, and I guess the divorce was messy. He didn't die in the house, but in the driveway. He ran a hose from his exhaust into the window of his car. My parents lived in there for over 10 years. We always joked about the place being haunted. The basement in particular had a creepy feel to it. I never got the whole "feels like you're being watched" feeling before then, and haven't since, but you just got that feeling. There was always small things going on, creaky floors, breezes and stuff like that. Most were dismissible. But here's some things that stand out. My mother was reading a book in the living room late at night. Sometimes she had trouble sleeping and was going to read until she got tired. This night she was sitting there and heard a metal noise like a ting, then the clack 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 of something hitting the floor. She turned around to see the final skid of a fork as it came to a stop beside her. 3 forks were sitting on the table across the room. She said it sounded like someone had hit the tongs and sent it flying across the room. Everyone was asleep at the time. Well, after my sister and I had moved out, my sister had a child. My parents brought an automated swing for the baby for when they visited. The swing would randomly swing on its own. It would be turned off, and it would be like someone had lightly pushed it. It happened enough that my parents would just kind of mention it lightly when it happened. They'd say, "Oh look, it's moving again," and go about their day. One night I was staying over at my parents' watching TV. It was 2 a.m. and I heard a tap tap tap. It was coming from the fireplace. The swing was about 7 feet from there for reference, and the tap was deliberate sounding, like a person or animal had done it. I shrugged it off and kept watching TV. 5 minutes later, tap, tap, tap. I'm intrigued now. I go to the fireplace expecting a trapped bird, but there's nothing. No taps, so I sit down, and once I pass the swing, it happens again. I have a better hearing vantage now, and it sounds like someone tapping on the mantel. I walked up to it, and when I get to it, it taps louder. Nothing was there that could have caused it, and the hair on my arm is standing on edge. I'm kind of spooked, turn around and go outside for a smoke, and the tap happens again. Instead of a third tap though, like in the other occasions, the swing swung forward like someone had pushed it with force. I have a couple of cigarettes instead of one. Finally, back when I was just out from school, before moving out, I was up late. I was in the hall when I hear my father yell, "What the hell?" I ask through the door if everything's okay. He exits the room and is white as a sheet. He said he woke up and saw 2 old ladies standing at the foot of the bed. They were just staring at him and mouthing something like talking to him. He said there was no expression on their faces and no sounds. When he yelled, they just disappeared. When I was 3 years old, my mother, father, 2 older brothers and myself moved into a 2-story house in Washington State. I remember the house was renovated and my room was on the 2nd floor, from my parents' room. When I was 4, my uncle died from liver failure in my bedroom during the night, and the next morning I woke up early to crying. I come to find out it was my grandmother crying later, but at the time I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know until I tried to go upstairs from where I had been sleeping on a guest bed during the night before. Once I walked to the 3rd step, I saw my father carrying the lifeless body of my uncle over his shoulder out the front door. I ran back to the spare bed and held my head in my hands, shocked and realizing he was gone. My mother came down after a while to try and break the news to me, and before she said a word I said, "I know, Mummy," and then we both cried. Not long after this, and until we moved out of the house when I was 17, footsteps walking down the hall could be heard coming and going to my room. So loud. My father thought it was an intruder, but when he looked, no one was there. I remember one night when I was about 10 years old. I remember seeing the outline of a man running towards me down the hall as I stood in the dining room. The outline flashed like a turn signal on a car as it got closer. The outline was a dark pink, almost like a light maroon color, and it disappeared entirely halfway down the hall, but I felt it move through me. I was so scared I froze, then sat down on a couch nearby and processed what I saw. I don't remember that night much, but I know the hallway still scared me, and I felt like I was being watched intently by something, and the feeling would go away once I crossed the threshold of my bedroom and closed the door. Over the next several years, everything slowly changed for the worse. After my uncle died, we inherited a few things from him. One of them was a flexible blanket-type game board, with one side being a backgammon board and the other being a Ouija board. The planchette came with it, and as far as I knew, no one ever used it. It took many years before my father found it, and being a Jehovah's Witness and having something like this considered devilish, he burnt it. I remember the black smoke emanating from it. It was thick, and the flames, what little they were purple, or at least I thought they were. I was 8 or 9 when this happened, and even though we had our problems as a family, after that board was burnt, everything began getting worse. My father was never fully the same in the house. He was abusive and would nearly black out in rage when he and my brother would fight. I remember instinctively trying to pull my father off my brother after he knocked him on his back while in a chair during an argument. I never knew what to make of this, but when he knocked me back and he was about to hit me with a closed fist, I remember his eyes being a dark red. He stopped, his expression changed, and he stormed off into his room from that point on. And he never got that angry with my brother again, at least not as far as I know. I know it was something possessing him, tormenting our family, as I had seen and felt something dark in that house. I never liked walking around that house, and the only place I felt the safest was my bedroom. My bed was my sanctuary from a lot of things. Not all the abuse, but some things that could hurt me, as my uncle haunted that room for years. I knew it was him, as his energy was always soothing to me. I remember a few times I would be too scared to sleep, or couldn't due to insomnia, and when I wasn't sleeping with my stuffed white rabbit, its arms would move in the dark, as if he was making it dance to calm me down so that I could sleep. All the abuse I endured in the house finally stopped when my parents divorced, and we went our separate ways and sold the house. I am now 30 years old, happily married and living in another state, and I still occasionally dream about that house. Mostly nightmares. I now know the house is haunted, but not by my uncle, because I crossed him over when I was in my 20s and could defend myself from the supernatural. No, what's there now is dark, and I know a portal is still open there. I just hope that someone notices it and knows how to close it properly. After my grandparents died, me and my girlfriend, now wife, moved into their house. We were doing the house up to sell, and multiple things happened to us over the 2 years we lived there. It started with the TV. It used to switch itself on nearly every night around 2 a.m. and would just be static, but very loud. We used to go downstairs and switch it off, and still have the same TV. It's never done it since we left that house, and that was 5 years ago. One time my girlfriend was sat on the couch and could feel someone stroking her back. On another occasion, my girlfriend was hoovering at the top of the stairs, and someone pushed her, but she grabbed the handrail and stopped herself from falling down the stairs. We also used to hear footsteps all the time coming up and down those stairs. There was another occasion where I was cooking, and the oven was by the window of the conservatory, so I could see inside. The door to the conservatory was on the right-hand side of the cooker, with frosted windows. My girlfriend is chatting to me, and as I'm cooking, she freaks out and says, "Someone just walked past the door." I see through the window and just laugh at her, but she was adamant someone walked past, so I opened the door and switched the light on, and there's nothing there. Later that night, I'm locking up to go to bed in the conservatory. The cat follows. I check the back door and it's locked. I go to switch off the light, and I stop before I do. The cat's freaking out, hissing, and she runs out of the conservatory freaked out. The light blows, shatters everywhere, and it's dark. Then something barges me in the shoulder, and I get knocked back and hit my back hard into the wall. Then I'm at the door of the living room. I don't know how I got there. My girlfriend is sitting down looking at me. "Are you okay? You've gone white." Apparently I'd ran into the living room and stopped at the door, but I've no recollection of this. I told her what happened and she said, "I told you I saw something." I went into the conservatory, cleaned up, and nothing has happened since. My shoulder and back were hurting for a good week though. I told my mum what happened, as she grew up in that house, and told me multiple stories of things that she used to see, hear, and feel in that house. Yet no one else did in the family of 7 that lived there. Just my mum, me, and my girlfriend. Then my mum told me what used to happen when I was 2 or 3 in the first house I lived in. It was worse than this, yet I have no memory of it. I live with my husband in a large house in the country. We live right next to a large field, and past that is a wheat field. We love to take our pit bulls out for runs out there. There is a street running horizontally from the field, as we do live in a very tiny subdivision out in the middle of nowhere. This happened in June or July of 2014. I was sitting on the bed talking to my mum on the phone at around 11 p.m. at night. My husband was in the study down the hall. The 2 windows in our master bedroom face outside into the backyard. Everything was normal until I heard what sounded like a plane landing in our backyard. Only it didn't sound like a plane engine in the slightest. It was so close to the windows and the ground that the house shook. It was so loud that I couldn't hear my mum clearly anymore. Well, this noise freaked my cat out, so she bolted to hide under my dresser. I told my mum to hold on as I rushed to the back door to see what in the world was making such a loud, explosive engine noise. And that's when I heard the explosion. Great. Now whatever is in the backyard exploded. I threw the door open and see nothing. Not a darn thing. And it's silent. Not a car, not a person, not a plane, nothing. I assumed that an 18-wheeler must have crashed outside. Perhaps they needed help. So I ran around into the front yard and looked up and down the horizontal road by the field looking for a crash. Nothing. All noise was gone. I looked up the street next to us as well. No one heard it. I was the lone dingbat outside at 11 p.m. I went back inside and told my mum I'd call her back, because now I'm freaked out, and I just heard World War III happen and there's no explanation from where it came from. I then asked my husband if he heard anything, and he told me he felt the house shake a bit, but he was gaming with his headphones on so didn't hear a thing. Apparently, Castile, our pit bull, didn't hear anything either. She didn't bark or stir. I hope I explained this well enough, because I'd really like to know what I heard. The noises had to have come from somewhere, right? I don't understand how our neighbors behind us didn't come barreling out of their house looking around for the noises like I did. Any insight would be appreciated. This didn't happen to me, but to my father-in-law and 2 brother-in-laws. The family I married into loves to hunt. I now love to hunt as well. My father-in-law had a friend that allowed us to hunt on his land near Jacksboro, Texas. My father-in-law's mother lived nearby, so when we went to hunt, we stayed with her. On this particular trip, my father-in-law and 2 brother-in-laws went hunting. So they get to my father-in-law's mother's mobile home, and eventually they all head to bed. My grandmother-in-law heads to her room, and my father-in-law and brothers-in-laws sleep in sleeping bags in the living room. The mobile home was being renovated, and I heard what you just thought, so there wasn't anywhere else to sleep. Previously, this house was abandoned when she bought it. The rooms were spray painted black and had red pentagrams everywhere. According to her, there was a spirit there, but it didn't bother her. Everyone was just like, sure grandma, whatever. So everyone's asleep. The two brother-in-laws are on the floor and my father-in-law was on the couch. One of my brother-in-laws wakes up because he got really cold and left a draft. I checked the doors and windows and they were all shut, so he laid back down and tried to go to sleep. But for some reason he still felt ice cold. My second brother-in-law begins to stir and notices that his brother's awake, and they comment to each other that it's very cold in the room. All of a sudden, a strong gust of icy cold wind blows through the room. It had come through the front window and blew the curtains out into the room. As the curtains fall back into place, they fall into the shape of a human figure, like someone was standing between the window and curtains. My brother-in-laws nudge each other and ask if they had just seen the figure in the curtains. One of them goes, "I'm about to grab my gun and leave." All of a sudden, my father-in-law, who happens to be a pastor, sits up on the couch, points his finger at the figure and says, "I rebuke you in the name of the Father and Son and Holy Spirit. Leave this place now." The curtain drops back to their usual place and the temperature returns to normal. My father-in-law lets out a grunt, lays back down and goes back to sleep. My two brother-in-laws didn't sleep a wink that night. The three never went back to that house again. I can't blame them. I never went back after hearing the story either. Nothing paranormal has ever happened to me. My auntie who is pregnant is ill, and she's staying in the hospital. She lives in a converted farmhouse in the countryside, up the road from our small town, so kind of in the middle of nowhere. Her boyfriend has been staying with her for the past 2 nights, as they need someone to mind the house while they're away. My uncle, my sister and me have been staying over to watch the house. Tonight, my uncle is visiting my auntie in hospital, so he left me and my sister home alone to mind the house. I'm 19 and she's 15. I was in the box room where me and my sister had been sleeping. I just finished my college work and was eating a salad when I heard my sister on the landing. I knew she was talking to me because I heard her say my name but couldn't hear exactly what she was saying. I went over to the door and I was about to step out of it when I heard her ask what was taking me so long. Confused, I walked onto the landing and saw that she was standing outside the bathroom, and I could also hear the shower running. I asked her what she was doing, and I saw her jump out of her skin and turn to look at me. She looked really confused and asked what I was doing. I asked her what she was doing outside the bathroom with the shower running, but she looked at me in confusion and said that I turned the shower on. I told her that I'd been in the room for the last 2 hours doing work, and I literally watched her turn white and run up to me. I asked her what was up, and she said that she was downstairs watching telly when she decided to go and have a shower, but she already heard the shower running with the door closed, so assumed that I was in there. She peels through the gap in the door and saw the shadow of me moving around behind the glass of the shower. The glass is tinted, so you can't see any figures of the person. She then started telling me to hurry up, not realizing I wasn't even in there because she knows I take ages in the shower. After she told me this whole story, we both ran downstairs and onto the landing. We just didn't say anything and pointed to the bathroom, and it freaked me out so much that we just ran down the stairs. We haven't gone upstairs since, and are just huddled in the living room with the TV on full blast. What the hell is happening? I can still remember this quite vividly. A little background first. At the time I lived in this creepy older house, a dual-unit Victorian, and sometimes me and my older sister would notice an unexplainable shadow from the corner of our eye. even at the same time. We never let it seriously bother us, and anyway, there was always an adult round within earshot. My mum just picked me up from school, and right when we arrive at home, she mentions that she forgot to buy an ingredient for dinner, and says that we need to go to the market. I politely refuse, since I really wanted to watch the Transformers, as it was one of the 5-day special linked series. I think it was The Return of Optimus Prime, which was about to start. And hell, I'm a big kid now, a 6th grader. I'll be fine. She asks again to make sure, and I assure her again that we both know that the neighbors, who are actually our relatives, are home, and I can go there if anything comes up. Before my mum leaves, she talks to the neighbors to mention that I'm home. Rejoice, free at last. I'm the man of the house. Immediately I turn on the kitchen TV and break out my Lego to play on the kitchen table. So I'm watching Transformers while playing with my Lego, and I fumble with a piece which lands past the doorway into the adjoining hallway. I ignore it since I didn't want to miss a moment of Transformers. After 10 minutes later, I notice the shadow in the corner of my eye, right where the Lego lies on the floor. I'm freaked out a bit, to the point that the hairs on the back of my neck are standing up. But hell, Transformers is on, and I'm a big kid, and decide to turn the volume up on the TV. Minutes pass. I've forgotten all about the Lego, and I'm fully engrossed watching Optimus Prime do his thing. Then suddenly, something hits me on the side of the head, and I distinctly hear a click-click sound as the Lego lands on Lego. My internal alarm goes off, and I slowly turn my head towards the Lego piece in the hallway. It's not there. Screw this, I'm out, and a moment later, I'm at my neighbor's banging on the door. 2 years ago, my family moved into a very nice apartment complex in the Houston, Texas area. We were looking for a nice complex and went in and was told by the assistant manager they had a model apartment that was used for viewings up for grabs. She mentioned that it had not been occupied for a long time, but she was willing to give it to us. We moved in a month later without giving it much thought. The apartment had a studio/attic that was connected to the stairway. The attic/studio was open, and from the attic you could see the living room looking down. Every time the maintenance people had to do something, they were very quick to leave and not mingle around too much in the apartment. The maintenance manager once made a remark and said, "I never thought they were going to lease this apartment again." When asked why, he was very quick to change the subject to avoid answering our question. I'm a graveyard shift nurse, and my wife and kids stay at home alone 4 times out of the week. During my days off, I stay up at night watching TV. I noticed in the living room, close to the stairs, a heavy cold presence, as if someone was looking at the between hours of 1 to 4 a.m. every time. I felt a presence watching me at these times, to the point where I would oftentimes leave the living room. I felt somebody was at the stairwell looking down on me. Fast forward a year, and we had moved out, and me and my family moved into our first new home. I told my wife randomly that I felt comfortable in this new home and didn't feel a bad energy watching me. My wife turned pale as snow and asked, "You felt the same energy too watching you from the stairway at early morning hours too?" We both turned pale, as we both realized at that moment we had lived in an apartment that housed a spirit. To this day, we don't know exactly what happened. Our assumption is that someone ended their own life by jumping from the studio attic into the living room. The management locked the unit for a long time and then decided to lease it again. To this day, no one in the complex will open up and talk about what happened in apartment 2811. Shortly after we moved into our new house, my brother found a couple of used bullets and shells under the basement stairs. The bullets were pretty destroyed, so he threw them away but kept the shells. They looked like handgun bullets, maybe 9mm or something. We didn't think much of it, but within a year, we started noticing weird things. One day we heard scratching at our door. All 3 dogs were inside, and when we opened it up, there was nothing in the yard. Even creepier was the fact that sometimes in the snow we would find a dog track far too large to be our own dogs in the yard. We thought it might just be our imagination, but one day we saw a huge black figure go flying by in the window and look outside. Once again, to see nothing. We were both pretty spooked. Then a few years later, we were in the basement, and when we looked away, the head of a doll moved slightly to the left. It was slow and progressively creepier because eventually it was facing my brother and I. We were both across the room, so this was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. We even recorded it, but the camera was pretty garbage, and the battery died before it had fully swapped over to us. We both went into the other half of our basement, and when we went back, the doll was in its original position. We were both pretty traumatized, and that wasn't the last of it. The last major thing I remember was when we were in the living room together playing games. It was getting darker, but you could still see shadows from outside every once in a while. The bathroom door was wide open, and my brother and I saw the same thing. At first, we thought it was a shadow, but it wasn't transparent. Basically, there was a black figure in the bathroom, and when my brother walked over it, it darted away. Even though now I don't believe in paranormal stuff, I often question these events and wonder if maybe I should. This happened in the early hours of a fall morning. My boyfriend and I had to sleep in separate bedrooms, as the mattress in the room we were using previously was hurting his back. It's important to note that in these rooms, they are next to the porch, so someone could knock on our window, for example, which is exactly what happened. My dad startled me when he came up to the window. He was trying to scare me, obviously, and he said, "What are you doing?" So my dad succeeded in scaring me. I know he's obviously come to pay a visit, so my boyfriend, who heard him as well, and myself, walked the small distance in order to get to the front door. We open it together and are greeted by no one. We look around and call for him, but he doesn't reply. So that's when we start getting weirded out. We assume he must have parked towards the back. So we walk off the porch, down the sidewalk, through the gate, down the side of the house to the garage, which is located in the back of the house a little ways away, but is closest, so we would have been able to run to the garage within the amount of time it took for us to open the door. There's no dad and no truck. We think that maybe he's hiding on the other side of the house or parked outside the gate, but that's very unlikely, as we would have heard him. So we resort to calling him. "Hey, where'd you go?" I say. He replies, "What do you mean? I'm at home. Linda took my truck to work." Linda works a few hours every morning, and that was indeed the case. She was out. After a little bit of arguing, I tell him that I'd just heard him outside my window and to stop messing with me. But during our conversation, Linda pulls up to the house and he gets her on the phone, and she confirms that she was out with his truck. He tries convincing me that it was other people, but I'm telling him I know what he sounds like and looks like. The weirdest thing is, my boyfriend heard it, and I saw and heard him. I have no idea how to explain this. How to explain that I saw his doppelganger. Has this ever happened to anyone? Or does anyone have any ideas on what it could have been? I'd love to hear your thoughts. My grandmother is almost 60, and I'm in really bad shape. My aunt just left her to go to college, so my family decided to move her in with us. My mother and I were almost done pulling all of my grandma's stuff in storage. It was pretty late, about 2 in the morning, and the house's power goes out. And we're on our way back to the house getting the very last of the stuff. And I looked at my mum and said, "Hey Mum, I know this sounds weird, but I wish I had more paranormal experiences in my life." She laughed and said something not important. We finally made it back to the house, and I realized my grandma's cat was in one of the rooms in a pet carrier, so I knocked on the door and said the cat's name. I walked away, and all I heard from that room was the cat hiss, and then knock, knock, knock. I'm only 15 and don't normally curse in front of my mother, but I ran out of the house screaming holy shit. She asked what's wrong, and I said that I knocked on the room with the cat and it knocked back. And then she told me, "That was knocking? I thought you dropped something." She heard the knocking and she wasn't even inside the house. Sadly, I had to go back in and get the cat, and on my way off the front porch, me and my mum both heard something, and the best way to explain it was when you wake up from a very deep sleep, and all they do is make a groaning sound. That kind of sound. We got into the car as fast as we could and drove away. We told my grandmother about what happened, and she told us that she heard the knocking coming from that door every night. It would wake her up and make her think someone was breaking in. And I even remember her telling us about it a few weeks ago. I haven't been back to the house since. My wife and I used to live in this run-down duplex. Through the front door was the living room connected to the kitchen, with a hallway that went out to the rest of the rooms in the place. One night, I was walking back to our bedroom and looked up to see a man with a faint blue glow wearing one of those old-time railroad outfits. I could see him in my peripheral, but when I went to focus on him, he was gone. Now, this is really unsettling for me, because my grandfather had died not too long prior, and he used to work for Frisco. So I moped back into the living room, thinking that I was just upset with having lost him, and that my imagination was playing tricks on me. Well, in walks my wife from our room down the hallway, and she's a shade paler than usual. I ask her if she's alright, and she just kind of shakes her head. This is gonna sound crazy, but I just saw a guy with glowing blue eyes wearing this weird uniform, kind of like what you see in the movies for guys that used to work on railroads, and my jaw hit the floor. Neither of us were really freaked, even though we were a little startled, but my grandfather passed away before I was with my wife, and I never told her what he did for a living. A few days prior, my wife had drawn a salt line at the front door to keep slugs from coming into the house, as a bonus creepy factor. My mother moved into a rental home recently. I always thought something was off with the person that we were renting from, because they were very quiet and always eyeballing the rooms of the house. After living there with my mother for a few months, here are my paranormal experiences. My parents are divorced, so when I stay at my dad's for 2 weeks, my mother goes to her 40-acre property with my stepdad. Occasionally, I will stop by at the rental house to grab stuff or play computer games. We started noticing lights turning on and off and doors opening and closing. It doesn't happen often when we are in there for a while, but when we come back after 2 weeks of being gone, that's when the activity picks up. A few things happened a few times while I was staying there, and things like my bed sheets being yanked off me while I'm chilling in bed, and my wireless headphones cracking and making weird glitchy sounds that never occur at my dad's house. The sound could be most compared to a modem startup or an old-timey dial-up that sounds a bit distorted. My mother keeps having her blinds tampered when she comes back, and she finds her blind clips on her bed every once in a while, even though she doesn't move them. Her toilet seat occasionally is left upwards randomly, and it's neither me or my brother or stepdad, as none of us are around or even use her bathroom. Occasionally, we will hear commotion in the living room, but when we look in there, nothing is going on and the sound stops. One night, while I was writing my paper for one of my college classes and working on my computer afterwards, a hammer and screwdriver were thrown into the garage floor while I was upgrading my PC components. Shortly after, I heard rustling in the direction of our bedrooms and found mine and my mother's bedsheets rustled up. My ex worked in a kitchen in one of the oldest universities in the UK, Oxford. Being a little bummed that he had to work a few days while I was visiting, I cruised around town solo, and would then come to meet up with him at work when his shift would be ending. On one day, I showed up a little earlier because I had to pee like crazy, and though I could just use their bathroom, he let me in, showed me a little twisty staircase, and said that the ladies is down there, and rushed back to work. Being more than a little stoked to being able to explore the downstairs of an ancient building, I was like, cool, and headed down. I located the ladies' room and then proceeded to do the quickest pee of my life. It was totally inexplicable. The feeling in this beautiful little Victorian bathroom was horrific, really oppressive, like it wanted me to get the hell out of there. It was also freezing, but I just didn't know that it was English architecture. Anyway, I just noped right out of those stairs and hung around the back, waiting for him to sign off. Later that evening, I casually asked how it was working in such an old building, like if he had ever found it spooky in the evenings, and he said, no, not really. He was looking at me though, kind of like he knew, and asked why I was asking. And I said, oh, the bathroom was just really creepy. And he said, yeah, my mate went down there for a leak once and saw a lady with her back turned to him in the bathroom. He was like, oh crap, and backed out, apologizing profusely, thinking he went into the ladies by accident. But once the door closed, he confirmed he was in the right one. It struck him that the woman he saw was wearing really old clothes, like at least a few 100 years back kind of outfit. Kind of freaked out, he opened the door again to tell the woman it was actually the wrong toilet, but she was gone. My parents' vacation house was haunted by my grandfather, who died 2 weeks before I was born. Until I was 12, we made a shrine for him. But that's a long story, and the shrine did the trick. Anyway, my latest and really most compelling events have been in my own house, though nothing has happened lately. A few years ago, I was home alone, sitting at the dinner table having lunch, when all of a sudden a painting flew off the wall. It was above our keyboard and landed a good 4 feet from the wall. Nothing else in the house moved, and we lived in Nevada, where earthquakes are rare. I'm from the SF Bay area and lived in Humboldt, Colorado for 8 years. I know earthquakes. I've never seen my dog bolt up the stairs so fast. Then a month later or so, I was getting ready for bed. My significant other was asleep, and I hear a bang from the bathroom. We have glass doors on the shower, and he keeps his toothbrush in there, so I figured the cat had knocked it over. Well, because it's a cat. I look down, and the cat is standing by the bedroom door. Somehow the toothbrush flew across the shower hard enough to make a very loud noise, and we found it in the tub after. Weird. This was late November of 2012, and I was doing an install in a winery in Northern California. It was a long day because we were working out of town, so we worked late to get it finished in one day. I started driving home around midnight and had about a 3-hour drive back home to Oakland. It's about 1:30 a.m. and I'm outside of Stockton, and I see this girl standing on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. She's wearing a white dress that ends at about 3 inches above her knees, and she's barefoot, with long black hair flowing down her shoulders, and is standing statuesquely. I look at her as I drove by, but she didn't move, didn't acknowledge my loud truck as it passed or anything. I was pretty freaked out, because you always hear stories like this, and then she appears in your vehicle, but that wasn't the case. She just stood there in the night. The thing that was most weird to me was that it was a cold night, about low 40s, and was drizzling a bit, and she was wearing a short dress with no shoes standing on the asphalt. If this is just some girl who does this for fun to freak people out, I feel like she would have been extremely cold and shivering, but this girl didn't move. After I got home, I was still thinking about it and searched Ghost Girl outside of Stockton, CA, and found a bunch of articles and stories about the East 8 Mile Road Ghost Girl, and most of the descriptions fit what I saw to a T. I never went back to the area because I moved to another state shortly after, but I want to travel back there to see if I can find her again one day. My parents built their house several years before I was born, and the lot they chose to use had a house that had long since fallen down on it. When building, they had to fill in the old well, and while digging the foundation, they found old plates, cups, and bottles, some of which they've actually kept in their china cabinet. In the 20 years that I lived there, strange things would happen around the house. Household items would go missing, later to be found elsewhere. My father told us that he heard someone talking upstairs one night when he was there alone. Lots of odd and weird things. I became very familiar with the creaks of doors, stairs, and floors in the house. The strangest thing that happened to me was one day when I was there alone. I heard someone walking across the floor upstairs. I was so familiar and in tune with the sounds of the house that I could actually pinpoint where the steps were coming from, and I could tell that the steps were getting closer and closer to the stairs. Then I heard the top stair squeak, and then the 4th step down make a noise. It had a very familiar thunk. Then the 6th, then the 8th. Whomever or whatever was upstairs was now coming down. I knew for a fact that I was there alone, and the hairs on my arms stood straight up, as they are this very moment just remembering it. I was really close to getting up and running out, but I wanted to see who or what it was. When the footsteps finally hit the bottom, I was completely still, staring into the hallway where the footsteps led to nothing. But you know that feeling when you're being watched? That's what it felt like as I stared down the hall. It felt like someone was staring back at me. But there was no one there. My mum would joke about a poltergeist in the house, maybe a child who used to live in that old house that once stood on their land. And after that moment it wasn't a joke that I found very amusing anymore. This happened when I was in Cub Scouts. We were on an overnight trip to an old naval destroyer and submarine. But we were sleeping, and of course I had to wake up. I thought I heard something like one of the doors opening, but it could have been just my imagination. But after, I looked to my mother to see if she was okay, because I was scared, and then I swear I saw an orb float in front of her. I then freaked out and covered my head with my sleeping bag and passed out. On a later trip, it said that the place had been found to be haunted and investigated by ghost hunters, so maybe I did see something. On another occasion, I was going to my aunt's house, which is somewhere I loved going to, but the basement always gave me really bad vibes. I was the one who had to sleep on the couch. I slept fairly well, but then of course I had to wake up again. Out of the large window in front of me, I swear on my life that I saw a line of apparitions coming out of the woods behind the house, and I told everyone about my experience that morning. My aunt then told me that she came back home with my cousin and ended up falling asleep on that same couch with him on a crib next to her. She woke up to an apparition of an older lady leaning over his crib. Maybe it was just a dream, but they think it actually happened. Oh yeah, and for added creepiness, there's a pet cemetery next to the house. This last incident is a little shorter. I had just finished taking a shower and was walking towards my room to get dressed. My room is at the end of a dark hallway, but when I looked at my door, I saw an apparition of a younger lady. She was looking at my door. I got scared and ran downstairs, and when I finally got the courage to go back upstairs, of course the apparition was gone. I've had several strange experiences happen at my dad's house. There was a hand mark on the wall in my dad's house, like a print from someone with dirty hands. A really big hand. Nothing extreme, just big. And every time we would wipe it off, it would come back the next day. Whatever was in my dad's house seemingly also targeted his girlfriend. Almost every time she was alone in the house, she would hear noises of doors opening or faint whispering in other rooms. I heard the whispering too, loud enough to hear it, but not loud enough to actually understand what they were saying. There was this one time my dad's girlfriend was showering and felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned around and there was nothing, and then remembered she was home alone. One other time when she was cooking, a can of beans was thrown out of the cabinet to her head. My dad also reported seeing people around his bed at night. I've seen a little girl in old clothes from the corner of my eye several times from when I was there. They now try to control it by burning incense and sage, something prescribed in specialized rituals. It became something quite normal to me generally. I've experienced way more stuff though, much to my dismay. I was in a major car accident over a decade ago. My car was hit by another car in such a way where I lost control of the car. The car somehow went on a full circle on the highway. I T-boned a Jersey wall, completely destroying it and cracking the next two in line. And I bounced off that onto an off-ramp with my side of the car facing traffic. I'm about to exhale when I hear, "Hey kid, when I start counting you have 8 seconds to move your car or you're gonna be hit by an 18-wheeler. Do you understand?" 8, 7, 6. Voice didn't have to tell me twice. I threw my car into drive and got on the shoulder. At 1, an 18-wheeler drove by the spot my car was parked on. I should have died, according to the cops surveying the crash site, but I walked away with a few bruises and needed a root canal a few days later. I probably imagined the voice, but damn, I'm believing it was something otherworldly. I've always felt like I was being watched in my room, and if I had the door open to the hallway, I'd swear I'd always see someone walk by the corner of my eye. We had 2 cats, and sometimes they'd be in my room sleeping. They would sit bolt up, stare at the door, and nothing I did could move them for a long time. This happened often. One day, in my bathroom, the shelf that had my sister's beauty stuff randomly lost hold of all of the items. The thing was, the shelf wasn't loose or hanging, and all the stuff had to bounce out of our 2-inch high lip into the sink. One time, in the middle of the night, my sister's 100-year-old dresser she got as a gift from our grandma just fell over. This thing weighed a ton and was built like a tank. My sister said she heard the sound of someone pushing it. My mom and sister used to yell at me for sneaking around the house. Only I wasn't, or I wasn't home. They said they saw a man in the shadows and thought it was me because it was about my height. One day we also ran into the old owner, and my mum casually asked the lady if she had ever experienced anything in the house. The lady started crying and said no one believed her, but yes, she experienced a lot there too. I moved out of there and don't miss the place. I've had a few paranormal experiences all within the house I lived in as a child. The first time I ever truly remembered one was when I was in high school. It was late and I had just said goodnight to my family. I went into my room, closed the door, and got ready for bed. As I was laying down in bed, no more than 5 to 10 minutes after resting, I felt what seemed to be a handprint pressing against the edge of my bed near my feet. I bolted up, expecting to see my younger brother. However, upon inspection, no one was there. In fact, I could hear my little brother joking with my mum in the kitchen, which wasn't too far from my room. But there was no way he could have snuck out without me noticing, since there was a large space between the foot of my bed and the door. Freaked out, I bolted from my room, panicked, and tried to put as much distance between my bed and I saw my brother and mum staring at me in bewilderment as I ran into the kitchen in hysterics as I attempted to explain to them, but was told it was all in my head and go back to bed. I was ashamed and embarrassed since I had no proof to what I experienced, but I knew it wasn't in my head. And I had enough people later who experienced things in that house to prove me right. I once saw a will-o'-the-wisp. For those who don't know, it's a light seen at night in desolate areas of the countryside, hovering in the distance like a ghostly lantern. It's one of the most widespread legends in the world, having many different versions in a variety of cultures, and is believed to be a ghost or demon. Scientifically speaking, the most plausible explanation regards to the decomposition of certain chemicals in a corpse, often cattle, that creates phosphoric acid which can create a light. However, when you're in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night, fight or flight gives very few cares to science. I grew up in a house that was creepy as hell. Everyone saw shadows move, everyone lost things, and everyone heard voices in that house. People who had never heard the stories about it would come into the house for the first time and comment on strange things. One night during the summer, I'm laying awake on my bed trying to fall asleep, but I can't. It's too hot, and it feels weird in the room. I'm on my right side, then my left, then back again. This whole time, my brother is singing and tapping in the bunk above me. Finally, pissed, I reach up to push up on his bed. I could do this in retaliation when he was loud. As I roll onto my back, I feel a hand through my mattress. It started at my neck and swept down my back, pushing the mattress as I went. It scared the ever-living crap out of me right there and then, and I never did figure out what that was. Before I was born, my dad's older brother had drowned in a river a year or two prior, and he was driving back home to the family farm, which is about 20 minutes out of town. On the way back between the city and our farm is where his older brother was buried. He was driving home after a night out, and he said he could kind of feel himself start to fade into sleep. He was driving past the cemetery where my uncle was buried, and he heard a voice say, "Man, I'm tired." He immediately perks up and looks over to see his brother sitting in the passenger seat of the car before he sort of fades away. He said he was wide awake after that. I've never known my dad to lie in my entire life, so I'm very inclined to believe him. We've talked years later about other times we had seen certain things in the house I grew up in as well as that, but we couldn't explain it, nor some of the other things. My house has always freaked me out at night. I'd always hear my computer chair creaking when no one was in it. Sometimes cabinets would be open. Whenever I would sit at my computer, my back would be facing a window, and I always got the creeping sensation someone was watching me. When I got that room remodeled and added a door to my backyard in that room, it only got creepier. Late at night, I'd hear small taps at the door. Of course, I looked, and nothing would be out there, so I started ignoring it. But one night over the summer, while it was storming, there was a tremendous thump against the door. I ran to check it out, but wasn't able to see anything in the rain. The next day, the grass outside my door had been ground up as if someone were jumping up and down in it. In my bedroom, sometimes a quick flash of light would come through my blinds. I started folding them up, and it stopped though. I sometimes just feel unsafe when I'm alone now. When I was around 12 to 14, I lived in my own house where some unexplainable things happened, like cupcakes falling over and chairs moving. But there's one memory that sticks with me and gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. I share a bedroom with my twin, and we had bunk beds. I was the top bunk. One night I woke up at around 3:30 a.m. and was trying to go back to sleep when suddenly, out of complete silence, I hear a creak from the bottom of the stairs. It was an old house, and I'd been living in it since I was born, so I figured it was just it being old. The sound slowly made its way up the stairs, and I was facing the door, which was slightly open to where I could see into the hallway, but not the stairs, so I just froze in fear. Once it reached the top, it stopped, and I pretended to be asleep but had my eyes slightly open to see if I could see whatever it was. The noise was so chilling. It finally stopped after 5 minutes but felt like forever. I then had the balls to turn over and stuff my face into my pillow to try and fall asleep. The next morning I walked downstairs and found all the chairs huddled up in the middle of the kitchen. I ended up moving out of that house and haven't experienced anything like that again. When I was maybe 9 or 10, my mum worked at the hospital for the graveyard shift. Me and my sister would usually sleep when she left. My sister was 5 at the time, and we were playing in the living room. We had a huge TV in there and 2 remotes for our TV because we had the same type of TV in my older sister's room. The remote for the TV in the living room was on the couch, but the remotes could be used for either room. So we were playing and suddenly the TV switches on. It made some weird noises, and then the 10 o'clock news started playing as normal. Me and my sister were scared out of our minds because neither of us had touched the remotes. Our cats were in the other room, and we both slept in my older sister's room because this was a 2-bedroom. And we ran into her room and saw that she was asleep too, and the remote was on the dresser across the room from the bed. I woke her up and she comforted us. It isn't that scary in retrospect, but I was a little kid, and it took me forever to fall asleep that night. Years ago, I fell asleep on my mother's living room sofa. She was already in bed, but my brother was out somewhere. Sometime in the middle of the night, I awoke to see someone standing over me and covering me with a blanket. It looked like a man wearing a bandana. I assumed it was my brother, but thought it was strange for him to be wearing that. The next morning I asked him about it, and he said he didn't even come into the living room when he came home, and it wasn't him who covered me. My mother also denied doing it, and no one else was in the house that night. I didn't really find that creepy until a while later, and reported the exact same thing happened to her. Apparently there was a ghost in that house that wanted to make sure people were tucked in when they fell asleep on the sofa. I guess it could be worse. I've always known my house was haunted. I remember as a kid, I had this weird thing I always did before walking out of my room. I poked my head out and checked both ends of the hall, like you would check if a car is coming across an alley. I did that, looked into the void of the darkness that was my dining room. Nothing. But when I turned to the kitchen, I swear I saw a red-tinted figure just standing there doing nothing. The bathroom was across the hall, and I really needed to go, but I remember starting to cry in fear before turning back into my room, flipping the light on, and hiding under the cover. I never saw that red figure again, so I just like to pretend it was a figure of my imagination. But any time I think of it, I'm still worried if it's real or if I'm just crazy. I used to go exploring abandoned places with my friends. The weirdest experience was at this abandoned amusement park we went to. The last time we had been there, a skeleton of a cat had fallen from a ceiling tile inside one of the buildings and freaked out my friend, but I wasn't there, so I didn't know much about that. But this park has a long walk to get to the entrance, and the gate has been bent just enough so that you could step through it at a right angle. So we walk probably a mile across a field to get to the gate and step inside. The first building is some sort of storefront type thing. We walked up to it, and one of my friends notices a light coming from inside, and we all fall silent as he steps forward to peek in. He looks back wide-eyed, and naturally, the urban exploring rest of us go over to the doorway and check out what he saw. The whole wall opposite us was on fire. It looked like it had been lit no less than 10 minutes before we got there, and we straight sprinted back to our cars after that. Freaky stuff. This story is from my parents, who bought a house and were fixing it up. Apparently the family before them were an elderly couple who had a grandson living with them, and one day the grandson died by getting hit by a car right outside or from the flu. I can't remember which one exactly. My mum was there painting and left the brush in a certain spot, came back later and found it elsewhere. My aunt and uncle would help out some days, and one day my aunt was there by herself and was about to leave, and the water upstairs turned on by itself, so she went to turn it off and went back downstairs only for it to turn on again. She freaked out and left. Finally, there was the time my uncle was there. He was preparing to leave, and the light switch on a chain at the top of the stairs began dangling. He left pretty quickly after that.